10 historical fiction books worth your TBR that aren't about World War II. Because, you know, like anyone, I love a good World War II story, but we've got to expand our horizons sometimes, you know? Okay, let's start with the one that I'm actually listening to right now. That is Cutting for Stone by Abraham Verghese. I do highly recommend the narration. I really like the narrator. His name is Sunil Malhotra. Now, this is a coming-of-age story that is based largely in Ethiopia. It's told from a first-person's perspective, and the main character is someone who is an identical twin when he is born to an Indian nun. So she's an Indian nun living in Ethiopia. He is born to her. She dies in birth, and when she dies, his father gives both him, the narrator, and his brother, so their names are Marion and Shiva, he gives them both up. He basically renounces them and leaves the country. So it's a coming-of-age story told from the backdrop of Ethiopian history, you know, largely 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond. I'm really enjoying it. The author is a doctor, so it's very medical in many ways, and there are many surgeries that are described in detail. So if you are a sensitive reader, I don't know if you can handle some of the descriptions and like, whoa, like there was a description, a guy who was in a car accident and basically, you know, just all the blood coming out, spilling on the floor, soaking his shoes. You know, it's got that kind of details in it, but I am enjoying this story. It's more slow paced than I would say maybe some other stories, but if you're not a sensitive reader, I do highly recommend it.
Okay, now that I actually have finished this book, I will say that it is very sad at the end. It does have elements of a Shakespearean tragedy mixed into a medical soap opera, mixed into a historical fiction novel. I just want to let you guys know so that you know exactly what you're getting into and so that you are reading books that you really enjoy.
Now, if you are looking for some South American historical fiction, I highly recommend Isabel Allende. I have read The Long Petal and the Sea. A lot of her novels revolve around Chile. She is a Chilean-American author. Her novels tend to be multi-generational. The Long Petal and the Sea, it was a multi-generational story. You are essentially learning about a family and how their lives are affected from the history of Chile. You know, all of the sort of things that are happening there in the country's history. I do have House of Spirits downloaded on my phone. I do need to get to that. That is really considered sort of, you know, Isabel Allende's greatest work. It actually happens to be her debut novel as well. But if you are looking for, you know, to get into some South American history, some South American literature, I highly recommend Isabel Allende. Now let's go to Afghanistan, A Thousand Splendid Suns and The Kite Runner. These are both by Khaled Hosseini. Now Khaled Hosseini, he is also a doctor, but he happens to be a phenomenal storyteller. One of the best storytellers I have ever read. These two books are two of my favorite books of all time. They deal with the same general time period, essentially Afghanistan under Soviet rule, Soviet occupation, and on into Taliban rule. A Thousand Splendid Suns deals with the story of two women and their unlikely friendship. And The Kite Runner is about a young boy as well as his friendship with a servant. These stories are very, very fast-paced. They have very propulsive plot, so if that's something you're looking for, these are great stories for that, as well as just phenomenal character development. These are two great historical fiction books that have nothing to do with World War II. As Long as the Lemon Trees Grow by Zulfa Katu. Now this is a relatively recent historical fiction novel about relatively recent history of Syria. It is a YA novel, and it is essentially about a main character, Salama. She is a young girl, and she is a nurse, and she's really wrestling with the idea of should she try to escape Syria or should she try to help the country sort of get out of the horrible state that it's in. I listened to this one. I very, very much enjoyed it. There was a love story element to it as well. I highly recommend it just because it has a very fast pace, so it's got very good plot development as well as just beautiful characters. Now, I know we're not talking about World War II, but this is a World War I novel. This is Birdsong by Sebastian Faulks. It is a multi-generational story, but it mostly focuses on the life of a main character, Stephen Raisford. It begins before World War I, and he has an affair with a French woman. He's an English dude. And then it's essentially the story of Stephen and Isabel, the woman, and essentially what happens to them through the war and sort of how their relationship progresses and what happens in terms of the child that Stephen has no idea Isabel is carrying. Now again, this is one of my favorite books of all time. Absolutely beautiful poignant ending, one where I was crying hysterically. It is a page turner. It's an interesting story because even though it's multi-generational and you think you know what happens to Stephen because of who you are learning about in the more recent generation, you actually don't. There's a lot of things that are sort of unanswered. So I actually stayed up late reading this book, which is very rare for me because I love my sleep. I had to finish it. I had to find out what happens. Absolutely fantastic. Now, another one that I recently listened to was Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. This is another multi-generational story. Now, I definitely enjoyed listening to this one. I will say one fault of this book is I don't think the characters were truly fully developed. I would say that I really enjoyed it because I was learning a lot about Korean history, especially as it related to Japan. So you begin around 1910 when Korea is a colony of Japan, and then you follow this family basically on up into the 1990s. But it's a history of Korea as it relates to Japan. I was very fascinated by it because it was a part of history that I really know nothing about, and I thought that the author did a really good job really explaining the history through one particular family. But again, I would say that it was a little bit lacking in terms of the character development, but I do highly recommend it. Now let's get into some books that are based in the United States, but they're not about World War II. So Kindred by Octavia Butler. If you've ever watched my channel, you may have seen me recommending this book. This is, again, one of my favorite books of all time. Yes, it does have a science fiction bent to it as well. It is technically a science fiction novel, but I would say it's more historical fiction. It's about a woman who goes back in time into antebellum Maryland, and she essentially has to ensure that one of her ancestors is born so that she survives in the future. Now, this is a rare book because it hooked me at page one. It had such beautiful, well-developed characters. I really felt like Octavia Butler was almost like she herself traveled back in time and then just wrote about her experience. That's how vivid and real this book is. Absolutely fantastic book. Once you start it, you won't be able to stop. Another historical fiction book about slavery in the United States. Not as good as Kindred, in my opinion, but this is The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. I definitely enjoyed this book a lot. I would say that it was a little bit academic in parts. The writing can get a little bit academic, I would say. It's like almost like you're reading a paper. But this is a story about Cora. She is an escaped slave, and she is essentially trying to escape slavery through the Underground Railroad. So it's a story about her life. It's definitely a hard book for sure, and I was wondering while I was reading it how he was going to end it. He definitely ended it with a note of hope, so I did appreciate the ending from that respect. I definitely highly recommend this book. I really enjoyed this book. So if you are looking for a historical fiction novel about slavery in the United States, I would recommend picking this one up as well as Kindred. And if you have any recommendations of this period of history, let me know as well. Let me know in the comments below. Now, a really fun historical fiction novel is The Revenant by Michael Punke. This is about basically the fur trade in the 1820s in the United States, but it's more a story of revenge. It's actually a story that's based off of a true story. It's based off of a man, Hugh Glass, who was attacked by a grizzly bear and then left for dead by the people in the trapping company that he was working with. And what's interesting about the story is that, you know, he himself, Hugh Glass, at least in the story, he didn't blame them for leaving him because, you know, they had many dangers that they had to worry about themselves. But what they did blame him for is that they left him for dead and they stole everything. So that if he did happen to survive, which he did, he would have no way of surviving. They stole his gun. They stole everything. They stole every means that he had of survival, including his gun and his food. So he happens to survive, and then this story becomes a novel of revenge. And you may remember it is also the movie that Leonardo DiCaprio won his Oscar from. But this is a fun book. It is one that is fast-paced, and if you love adventure stories, if you love stories about the wild, about survival in the wild, this is a great one. Now, another historical fiction novel set in the United States, but not about World War II, is Before We Were Yours by Lisa Wingate. Now, this one also is based off of a true story. It takes place in Mississippi in the 1940s, and essentially what was happening is there was a really terrible woman who was essentially stealing babies from people, very poor people who lived on the Mississippi River. But she was stealing their babies and then selling them, putting them up for adoption for more wealthy families. So this in itself is a multi-generational story. It is a mystery, and then it is also a story about several sisters who were snatched snatched away from their family and what happened to them. This was a page turner. I enjoyed this book, but it was a hard book, and what was even more shocking was the author's note at the end when I learned that so much of this was actually based off of something that really occurred. So there you have it, 10 historical fiction books not about World War II. Let me know in the comments below, what historical fiction books do you recommend that aren't about World War II? Because again, it's not that I don't like a really good, World War II historical fiction novel. It's just there's so many of them out there, and we've got to expand our horizons. And don't forget to subscribe.